Welcome to I Am Your Target Demographic. On this channel, I try to explain things that might be confusing or tricky to navigate. I've found success with covering religions, such as Catholicism, Mormonism, and even Scientology. Today we're going to cover Christianity, but specifically how the different denominations of the religion are different. I'm going to dive deepest into Protestant sects, so we're not going to cover Catholic or Orthodox groups. While these denominations are mostly Protestant, some wouldn't self-identify as Protestant. Now, as a heads up, this is going to be a superficial look at these denominations. Look at how long this video is. It'll be surface level, but hopefully a decent look at what separates and unites these groups. I also want to say quickly that this list won't cover every single sect of Christianity. It's a massive list. There are many different belief sets, but I'm going to do my best to cover a diverse group of them. So if you're already lost, let's briefly cover what the term Protestant means. In 1517, a German theology professor named Martin Luther challenged the policies of the Catholic Church, which was dominant at the time. Luther never intended to split away from the church, but rather he wanted to reform the church from within. The biggest problem he saw was the sale of indulgences, the idea that one could buy their way into heaven by paying more money here on earth. Money, incidentally, that went to pay for Michelangelo and the painting of the Sistine Chapel. The sale of indulgences rested on the authority of the Pope to decide Catholic doctrine, rather than on the Bible, which led Luther into conflict with him. In 1521, Luther and his protesters were excommunicated from the Catholic Church. In response, Luther burned the letter excommunicating him. The people who followed Luther and those with different problems who followed after were called Protestants because they protested the Catholic Church. So here we begin our discussion on the first denomination in this video, Lutheran. Martin Luther described Christianity through what he called the five solas, the Latin word for alone. He believed that we are saved by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone, by his sacrifice on the cross alone, as told in Bible alone. He rejected the idea that we could earn our way into heaven through paying money or performing good deeds or believing the right things. There is nothing that a human being can do to impress a perfectly good being like God. Therefore, God became human in Jesus Christ to unite humanity to himself and to save humanity from the deadly consequences of its own sin through his own death and resurrection. This is the gift of God's grace, which Luther believed we receive through the gift of faith. To Lutherans, faith is not believing in the right doctrines or making an intellectual decision for Christ, as some Protestant sects believe, but rather, faith is God initiating an intimate, trusting relationship with him. But to know the story of Jesus, one has to be able to hear it. Besides indulgences, another of Luther's problems with the Catholic Church was the insistence that the Bible could only be read and recited in Latin, the language of scholars. He translated the Bible into German, so that the common people could read and hear it for themselves. Luther also believed that clergy people should be allowed to marry, and that priests, monks, and nuns were not an extra special class of holy people. Any honest work done well was holy work, whether it was making shoes or tilling fields. With these exceptions, Lutherans still worship much like Catholics do, using many of the same forms. Lutherans still practice the baptism of infants like Catholics do, and believe that Christ is truly present in the bread and wine of the Eucharist, or as some people might call the communion. What Lutherans ultimately rejected is the idea that the authority of human beings is higher than the authority of the Bible, and that human authorities have the right to put rules and barriers between people and God. Around this same time, we have John Calvin, a French theologian who also parted ways with the Catholic Church, and had some differences of belief with the Lutherans. Specifically, the Lutherans held on to the idea that the Eucharist was actually and literally the body and blood of Christ, whereas the Calvinist point of view is that Christ exists in the elements alone, alongside the bread and wine. They both believe that Christ is present, as opposed to other denominations that we'll talk about soon that view this tradition as a symbolic gesture only. Calvinists also believe that God has predestined things to happen. If someone is saved, it is because God planned for them to be saved, and any choices we make in this process are because of his ultimate choices. We believe our sin is such a burden that we cannot pursue salvation without God's intervention and allowance. There is a handy acronym to help understand what Calvinists believe, called TULIP. Let's go through it quickly. Total depravity points to the notion that we are full of sin, and even more so, dead. God, of his own power, can save us. We are unable to do it alone. Unconditional election means that God chooses who receives salvation. The fact that it's unconditional means that both the good and the bad can receive salvation, regardless of their acts. Limited atonement means that not everyone will be saved. God has foresaw this future and decided already who will be saved. Not everyone will or can be. Irresistible grace means that if God chooses to give salvation to you, you will have no choice but to pursue it. And lastly, we have preservation of the saints. This means that if you are truly a Christian and truly want to embrace salvation, that God will never let you perish and will hold you close forever. Now let's transition away from Calvinism. While these denominations separated from the Catholic structure of the church, let's talk about Anglicanism, represented in the United States by the Episcopal Church. This church embraces what is called apostolic succession, meaning that their bishops have a succession line going back to the original 12 apostles. Anglicanism as a distinctive tradition traces back to St. Augustine of Canterbury, the first Catholic bishop in England. Lowercase Episcopal is used to describe any church that still uses this lineage, but we're talking about the uppercase Episcopal and Anglican churches here. Like the Catholic Church, they have parishes and dioceses throughout the world headed by bishops. Comedian Robin Williams said this about the strong similarities between the Episcopal and the Catholic Church.
Yeah, I'm an Episcopal, that's Catholic light. You know, same religion, half the guilt.
In terms of beliefs, they are often described as following a via media, or middle way, between Roman Catholicism and other Protestant denominations. After breaking with the Pope, the leaders of the Church of England selectively incorporated beliefs from the Continental Reformation into Anglican doctrine. They believe in grace alone, and there's special importance placed on baptism and communion, though they also acknowledge other sacraments from Catholicism as well, though not seen as required. Episcopalians in the United States especially are mostly known for their progressive social stances. They've long fought for a higher living wage for everyone and had an active role in the civil rights movement. They're also one of the only Christian denominations to allow same-sex marriage, if their presiding bishop permits it, and most do. LGBT church members are also eligible to be ordained as priests, with the first being Ellen Barrett in 1977. The first openly gay bishop was appointed in 2003, Gene Robinson. This was a divisive move in the church, and he even wore a bulletproof vest at the ordination following several death threats. As the Episcopalian branch split off, so did what we now call Methodists. This denomination is based on the teaching and writings of two brothers named John and Charles Wesley, who traveled from the UK to America to be missionaries to Native Americans. Now this failed mostly, but it strengthened their conviction, and they returned to England preaching salvation to all, which was against the Calvinist viewpoint of God preordaining who would be saved. They also used the term new birth, which has slowly evolved into what we call born again, though this term is used by all sorts of Christian groups now. The Wesleys and their other leaders in the movement also found themselves stretched too thin, and they focused on training and ordaining normal people to become pastors and teachers, again breaking from the more traditional denominations that focused on structure and power. Something else that the Methodist churches were known for was to focus on hymns, with Charles Wesley writing over 6,000 hymns in his lifetime. Churches weren't usually very musical at this time, so this differentiated the church then, but it continues to be a major factor in their worship services now. While this is a much more relaxed feeling as opposed to the Anglican/Episcopal churches, they do retain the structure of bishops that preside over certain areas, so they'd be classified as Episcopal with a lowercase e. We're now going to transition to the Presbyterian Church. This denomination eventually splintered from the Church of Scotland. In terms of belief, they usually align with Calvinist points of view, including God's predestination on who is saved and who is not. Presbyterian churches can dramatically be different, so you might find this thought in some churches and not others. They differentiate themselves from other denominations by focusing on a confessional type of tradition. They use statements such as the Apostles' Creed or the Nicene Creed to reaffirm their collective beliefs. They believe strongly in the community as a whole over the individual. This also connects to their focus on allowing all members of the church a voice, allowing all changes to go through a voting process with the general membership. Most higher-level church administration are elected into those positions. We're now going to cover Baptists, which is quite a varied group but united under one common belief: the rebuttal of the infant baptism and preference of the believer's baptism, usually for adults who find salvation. They also stress complete immersion during baptism as opposed to sprinkling. While they stress that immersion is the only way to be baptized, they don't see baptism as necessary for salvation, but rather an act that we should do to show the world our faith. The other thing that makes Baptists somewhat unique is that they don't have a central authority. Each congregation tends to have autonomy. They might be connected to organizations that give support or offer fellowship opportunities, but these congregations are all self-governing. This makes the label of a quote-unquote Baptist church somewhat tricky, as each congregation might have a different way to worship or a difference in belief on certain points. There is no overarching body or set of documents to bring these churches into alignment. Predating the Baptist denomination is the Anabaptists, which also rejected children's baptisms and instead focused on adult baptism. The difference between the two is really about culture, as the Anabaptists reach far further into history than the Baptists. The Anabaptists began in the late medieval ages, about 1500. Since this belief set is so old, it's hard to trace its origin, and there are even multiple theories on how it came to be. During these dark ages, we do know that Anabaptists were persecuted for having counter opinions, or even tortured and executed to try to stifle the movement. Anabaptists have now been split into many denominations, including groups like the Amish, Hutterites, and the Mennonites. The Amish and the Hutterites are mostly direct descendants of their original counterparts, so are considered ethnic groups, while the Mennonites have incorporated many new members into their congregations. All of these groups have a strong community and cultural aspect, including traditional clothes and even the dialect of their old homeland. The Amish, for example, formed from a schism of Swiss Anabaptists. They still read prayers and sing in German, but some of them speak what's called Pennsylvania Dutch. Now, there are some sects of the Anabaptists that have come into the modern age and have culturally assimilated, while some still reject modern technology and live in relative isolation. Even today, the core tenets of believers' baptism, nonconformity to the world, and a focus on pacifism are still stressed in most Anabaptist communities. There is a group that shares some of these values that might be confusing for the average person, and that is the Quaker population, who also prefer plain clothes and refuse to participate in war, though they differ greatly from the Anabaptists. The Quaker movement began just after the Protestant Reformation, as a man known as George Fox began to teach that you don't need an intermediary or a priest to commune with God. The actual movement was called the Religious Society of Friends, or Friends Church for short. They have a strong emphasis on missionary work, which spread the church throughout the world. The most recent account says that 52% of Quakers are now in Africa, likely due to these missionary efforts, specifically to countries like Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda. While the number of Quakers are relatively low, they have drastically different belief sets across these congregations. There are very traditional groups and very liberal groups and everything in between. One unique thing about the Quakers is their stance on communion, or the Eucharist. For a long time, the Eucharist in other churches was only prepared and served by men in the traditional churches, and the Quakers believed that women had every same privilege and right as men, so they denied taking the Eucharist out of principle. They've come to replace it with the idea of sharing meals together, similar to the Last Supper, and believe that Jesus can join people in that moment. Today, modern Quakers have generally assimilated into the larger culture in terms of dress, though there are a few that are drawn to live the old Quaker way and isolate from the world in certain ways. Now we're going to transition to one of the more sensationalized sects of Protestant Christianity and start discussing what it means to be Pentecostal. Being a Pentecostal Christian falls under the umbrella of what is called charismatic Christianity, a group of denominations that arose from a movement in the 1800s called the Holiness Movement, where Christians started to break off from other sects, most often Methodist churches, and tried to become more in line with the literal biblical scripture. Charismatic churches, and specifically Pentecostal churches, emphasize spiritual gifts much more than the other churches. or at least maybe emphasize spiritual gifts that are maybe underemphasized in those churches. One of these gifts is the speaking of tongues, which is where someone might speak in a language that is not understandable. What this language is or what it means is hotly debated. Some churches believe that the speakers are speaking in an ancient language that we've forgotten or is no longer used, while others believe the language is that of the angels of heaven itself. There are other people in these churches who typically have a gift of understanding tongues and can translate what is being said. Speaking in tongues is an uncommon practice, so it's often hard to believe it when it's happening, even for believers. Pentecostal Christians also engage in some other unique practices, such as potentially handling snakes, which is to prove that even dangerous animals cannot harm those doing God's work. These poisonous snakes do often bite the speakers, and sometimes the speaker even dies, though it's usually claimed to still be God's intent. The number of churches that still use snakes in their sermons is very low, even among Pentecostal churches. The third big difference in how you might have seen or experienced Pentecostal churches is through their belief in healing, often held in large tents as the church traveled and evangelized and healed the sick and crippled. They believe that with enough belief, even normal people could conjure up miracles with God's power. While not scientifically proven or disproven, there are many testimonies of healing actually occurring in these situations, enough to encourage its continued practice. These three things, the speaking of tongues, the snake handling, and the healing of the sick, are the most sensationalized acts of the Pentecostal churches. But like all denominations, it differs greatly from church to church. There are many Pentecostal churches that don't do any of these things, and look very similar to other denominations. Another form of Protestant Christianity that you've at least heard of is being an Adventist. There are many types of Adventists, but we're really going to dive into the largest portion of this pool, the Seventh-day Adventists. While some denominations differ from church to church, the Seventh-day Adventists have an overarching organization, the General Conference, which includes the office of the President, housed in Maryland in the United States. This governing body makes all large decisions, including debates on scripture and administrative decisions for the church. Why they're called the Seventh-day Adventists is that they believe that Saturday, not Sunday, represents the Sabbath, and they typically spend this day resting and enjoying fellowship with other believers. But they will not work or do errands on this day. Another distinctive belief for most Seventh-day Adventists is that hell, while usually seen as a never-ending torture, is not infinite in their belief set. They believe in what's called annihilationism, that after their final judgment, non-believers will instead be destroyed, total extinction. Adventists also put a huge emphasis on humanitarian work and education. In terms of service projects, there is an Adventist Development and Relief Agency that works in 125 countries and employs over 4,000 people. In terms of education, Adventists operate over 7,000 schools, including colleges and universities, with the largest being the Northern Caribbean University in Jamaica. Now, Adventist Christians sometimes share a similarity with another denomination that we're about to cover. The idea of celebrating holidays is a divisive one in the Adventist population, as some might choose to not celebrate holidays like Christmas or Easter, or even celebrate birthdays. Yet many do, so it's a divisive choice. The president of the church wrote a statement that it's up to each person to decide on their own. The church has no official stance either way. This is similar to what you may know or have heard about the Jehovah's Witnesses, often known for their lack of celebrating any holiday. This is a standard across their churches, that any sort of celebration is against God's will. Even Christmas is not celebrated, as God said to celebrate his death, not his birth. Birthdays are not celebrated, for it should be the spiritual birth that is acknowledged. Witnesses do not see themselves of the world, so they don't celebrate national holidays, and they do not glorify warfare in the military, so they don't celebrate holidays such as Memorial Day. This can be tricky to understand, especially for children, as they don't share in birthday or holiday festivities in the classroom. How the Jehovah's Witnesses worship is also a little different, as their churches are actually called kingdom halls. And typically, though not always, these halls don't have any windows and don't feature any crosses, so you may not even know that it's a place of worship. The answers for why the buildings don't have windows has a few prominent answers, but the most common is the expense and time of building a kingdom hall. Typically, these buildings are raised in just a few short days, so the luxury of adding windows is a burden on time. And why no crosses? Scripture says to not worship idols, which Jehovah's Witnesses see the cross as. It's a symbol, an idol, something other than God, so they choose to not use them. Like the Adventists, Jehovah's Witnesses also believe that extinction is the fate of the non-believer. The core tenets of what Jehovah's Witnesses believe differentiates them from any other sect of Christianity. Witnesses do not believe that Jesus Christ is equal to God. They do not believe in the Trinity as is traditionally seen. Should Jesus be revered and respected? Yes. But worship should solely be placed on God, which is likely another factor in removing the cross. They believe that Jesus was indeed the Son of God and did indeed give his life to offer salvation, but they also trust Jesus when he said that the Father is greater than I, John 14:28. So they focus their worship on God alone. Now that we're discussing denominations that diverge from traditional beliefs, it's time to cover what's called Christian Science, or the Church of Christ Scientist. This religion focuses on the fact that only the spiritual world is real, and that our physical world here is an illusion. So any sickness that people might face should be able to be addressed through prayer alone. Because of the name, people often confuse Christian Scientists with the Church of Scientology, which is very much not a Christian church and is the focus of another video all to itself. While this is a small denomination, it makes the headlines quite often, as many legal cases have been in the news in the debate over whether parents must give medical attention to a child, or if their potential death would be considered negligent. In most countries, even today, it is still their religious freedom that allows them to turn away medical help that would save their children. The actual history of these lawsuits is again tumultuous, with incidents that favor the Christian Scientists and incidents condemning their behavior. The law is still very messy, and all other religious organizations will often support Christian Scientists in these lawsuits, as the benefit of religious freedom benefits all of them. Before we end this video, you may be asking where other Christians are classified. Maybe you even are a Christian but don't know which of these denominations fit you. The term for most of these Christian churches is non-denominational Christianity. This basically means that these churches are autonomous. They don't exist under any larger umbrella and they don't report to any governing body. These non-denominational Christian churches include a large group of people. In 2014, it was cited as 6.2% of the United States population, the second highest group of Protestants, just under Baptists. Since these groups are varied, pinpointing their exact theological beliefs is tricky. If you're part of a non-denominational church or want to learn about them, you can start by asking questions about the church's stance on salvation, the Trinity, and sacraments such as communion. This should open up more opportunities for questions to make sure that their values align with yours. So hopefully this was an interesting journey. I know we didn't include every facet of Protestant Christianity, and even the denominations that we did talk about, it was fairly brief and superficial. Maybe someday we'll cover some of these branches more extensively, but this was meant just to give you a look at how they differ and what some of these groups are like. We have other religion videos to check out, so look at these videos highlighted on the screen and give them a look. Subscribe if you find this interesting, and thanks for watching.